about the systems and places where design actually can't reach. So that misfitting carries all the way through. So I'll just drop in on a couple of ideas here. In this limb chapter, we meet Chris, who you see on the right here. He's a white man in his mid-30s at the changing table with his newborn baby. And what he's got is one arm on the left side, which is a sort of normative arm, and then a residual limb on the right side. His arm tapers off a little below the shoulder. And Chris had 5 or 6 prosthetic arms built for him over the course of his childhood. And everyone who met Chris in his young years imagined that he would need the kind of best money can buy biomimicry prosthetic arm that you're seeing on the left. And you're seeing this sort of high-tech, you know, circuitry and chrome, very simulacrum of a normative arm and hand built from a laboratory. And we think of that as sort of like, that's what Chris would need. And all the doctors in Chris's life thought that is what Chris would need. But Chris, having been born this way, is quite adaptive and plastic in his life, lives his life basically one-handed, with incredibly dexterous feet and toes, and does the world in the way that all bodies do, in a deeply adaptive series of moves. But he did come up against this conundrum, which is to say, what is at least a two-handed job a lot of the time for a lot of us, that is changing a baby's diaper. And we drop in on him having rigged up this prosthesis that you're seeing here, which is just a little holster made up of felted wool and cords to suspend his baby's ankles so that he can do the work of changing the diaper one-handed. And Chris's, this very bespoke, just in time, $10 prosthesis is actually one instantiation in a vast history of prosthetics. And if you were to look right now at the Wired magazines and Gizmodos of the world, you mostly see that arm and hand on the left. You see this powerful, persuasive idea that a machine part that looks and feels like a regular arm is always the thing that's on offer. And it turns out that for lots of people, that may be a transformative tool, but for many others, there are all kinds of tools, a rich history of tools, some of which are high-tech and low-tech, some of which are tools that we opt into or opt out of, but that misfitting calls for lots of kinds of ways of thinking about adaptation. So the limb chapter follows 5 or 6 people who are looking for replacement parts for the things that matter to them. So not a kind of big tech saviorism story about prosthetics, but instead a kind of question about what are the replacement parts and what do they look like, and when do we opt in and opt out, and how would we know if and when our bodies change what we would want. So I'm showing you now a slide that's got a number of images of the characters and the stories that are throughout this limb chapter, including on the top left, a clinic that's part of the Jaipur Foot Organization. We travel to Ahmedabad in India to visit. There's a clinician here helping a boy with a lower limb prosthesis. The Jaipur Foot Organization has made low-tech limbs, 1.5 million, and distributed them for free all over India. And that's a real counterpoint story to the innovation kind of technology that lots of people point to, again, in the kind of the journalism around technology that points only to those high-tech limbs and kind of cyborg futurism. And meanwhile, there are these incredibly meaningful prosthetics being made all over the world for affordable materials and so on. We also meet Audre Lorde in the doctor's office after a mastectomy, opting out of a replacement breast after a mastectomy on one side, and celebrating an asymmetrical body, having survived this terrifying illness of breast cancer. And she kind of tangles at the doctor's office with the nurse about her choice not to opt into that replacement part. And the nurse says to her, "We wish you would wear it because it's kind of bad morale for the office if you don't." So Audre Lorde, who's pictured here, is teaching us in that encounter that prosthetics aren't just doing a kind of replacement part work, they are also how we make meaning of one another. There are incredible biopolitical and identity stakes there. We also tour through, on the lower right is a black and white image of World War II veterans, many of whom are using crutches and are missing some part of a leg. We look at the development of rehabilitation engineering, and that is the disciplinary home for building those high-tech prosthetics. They were built under a kind of national sense of obligation to these folks returning from the field. That's where the big research dollars and the priority funding has come from. And it's given us that high-tech story of prosthetic tools. But meanwhile, it's actually a richer, much richer ecosystem of the way we replace the things that matter. We end that chapter with Cindy, who you're looking at here, who's a 60-year-old woman who's a quadruple amputee, and you can see she has been, most of the digits on both of her hands have been amputated, and she lives her life with a rich panoply of low-tech tools, including rubber tubing for putting on her eyeliner and all kinds of inventive uses for cable ties and more. So all of this is meant to help complicate this story, that story of that prosthetic arm that we think of on the left as promising a kind of uncomplicated future in our relationship to prosthetics, when really the stories are rich and varied and much more interesting. Another chapter, the room chapter, I address this idea of what it means to dwell in the spaces that we live in. So what in our rooms and in our houses, how do we think about dwelling? And indeed, this question that comes up in disability when bodies meet the world, and that's about independence. And a lot of you, if you're thinking about the aging of yourselves or your loved ones, independence is usually at the heart of that question, how we can live the lives that we want to live with as much agency as possible. So we drop in on that chapter, and I'm showing you here the lobby of a dorm at Gallaudet University. We drop in on Gallaudet, which is an all deaf and hard of hearing campus. And here you're looking at the lobby, which is like a kind of glossy modern building with wooden rafters and cement floors and wooden benches surrounding a kind of half height wall pod where a number of people of various races and ages are speaking together in sign language in ASL. And all the design choices of this room, which look maybe to you like a kind of, again, generic modern building, have been chosen really with care to design around the condition of deafness instead of designing for a cure for deafness. So here again, the misfit question when it comes to deafness and engineering and technology usually lands at cochlear implants only, or only technologies for creating the capacity for hearing. But Gallaudet is actually a different proposition altogether, bringing the architecture of the world to honor and in fact organize itself in the envelope, the way architects talk about it, and the envelope around the condition of deafness. So the solid colors here, greens and blues on the walls and upholstery, are chosen for their nice contrast with a number of skin tones. The wood is chosen for its resonance for tapping or slapping to create attention. Those half-height walls create long visual fields for that visual language. You don't need sound barriers in the form of walls, and much more. There's a sort of 100-point series of design principles called Deaf Space. And we also visit the signing Starbucks in this chapter, which is a nothing more, nothing less than a Starbucks with deaf folks behind the staff counter. And in a very easy series of what we'd call service design moves, you can, as a hearing person, you don't need any extra instructions to figure out how you order your coffee and tea. And it's really interesting how all the dynamics change with a few subtle design interventions. That room chapter then goes on to look at independence and dwelling, and independence in particular with the history of Ed Roberts, who you're looking at here on the left, a black and white image of Ed Roberts and Herb Willsmore at UC Berkeley. They're both chair users. Ed Roberts was a polio survivor and was accepted to UC Berkeley in the early 1960s, but could not live in the dorm on campus as it was then, and worked with a doctor on the UC campus to live in the hospital on campus, and to live in the hospital as a dormitory, to create in that space what had been a clinical space, a space to dwell as a college student, and thereby to reinvent what college could mean. And he was joined by another dozen or so wheelchair users in the ensuing years, and they called themselves the Rolling Quads. They became a kind of force on campus, and with a kind of change in design. That is to say that the hospital, with its ecosystem of care and assistance, so these folks lived with personal attendants, helping them with their kind of daily decisions. They also had then to hire and fire these folks. They had to create a whole life redefining independence in the hospital that became a dormitory. So what started as design became an idea. And the idea is that independence need not be, for these folks, self-sufficiency, but it could instead be self-determination, that agency is what matters there, and that a life lived with help contains dignity and deep, deep value. So, so expanding our notion of independence. And it's a long story, but the UC Berkeley group is what launched the first Center for Independent Living there in the Bay Area, and then became the independent living movement, and has been replicated in these storefronts. You're looking on the right at the Northeastern Pennsylvania Center for Independent Living, which you can go to now. There's a bunch of folks in front of it in their parking lot. So it's been replicated in all 50 states and around the world. The idea of independent living as an adaptive state of self-determination, orchestrating an ecosystem of care by which a dignified life might be lived with help in it. And that's a powerful idea for all of us in rethinking our relationship to help. And the street chapter finally is about how public space, of course, becomes the public sphere. And this is nowhere more dramatic than in these kinds of instances. I'm showing you on the left an image of a curb cut, which is so modest and everyday, it's often gone to sleep in our imagination. That is just the cutting of curbs, just making a diagonal at the corner where a street meets the sidewalk and back up again. And this was rolled out, the cutting of the curb, the editing of the city, the elasticizing of the city, the meeting of that misfit at infrastructural scale, that was rolled out in massive numbers. Imagine the effort of that and the improbability of the activists who had to lobby for it and to say the city should actually remake itself to make wheelchair passage possible. So if you find yourself now dragging your wheel luggage and pushing your double stroller the way I have, you participate in those politics. And I do try to waken those politics for folks who think accessibility is hard. Where does design and disability really, where do we see it in evidence? This is where, at this powerful scale. But that street chapter also gets into all kinds of street encounters, including the history of, and trying to link the history of curb cutting with the guerrilla activism of things like tactical urbanism and bike lanes, as you see on the right. So you're looking at a provisional bike lane that was carved out with and tape and so on. And these are, in the city, tactical urbanism, of course, is citizen activism to try to reshape the street. So we look at curb cuts, but we also look at the guerrilla activism of disabled people. And then we also blend it together with tactical urbanism, also desire lines and desire paths. There's just an exploration, Jane Jacobs and the ballet of the city. There's just so much that disability has to say to all of those street politics. So that's where I'm going to end the overview. And I want to just, bring Rosemary in here now, who knows the book and helped read the book and edit and so on. But so Rosemary, we can talk about how we met, and I can start that if you like, or would you like to say something first to begin?
Well, I think it's important for us to talk about how we met and to put some human faces on this project. And so let me talk about how we met a little bit and ask you some questions.
Okay.
So we met maybe in 2014 when Sarah was a student in the master's program at Harvard in the Graduate School of Architecture. Mm-hmm. And I was at Radcliffe at the Institute there as a fellow for a year. And we more or less fell into one another's arms. And we found that we had a lot of things in common. And that is, we were both thinking about disability justice, if you will, disability studies, disability culture together. But when we got to know each other, we discovered that we had other things in common that ended up cementing our bond that are really, I think, crucial to your work and my work and to this book. One of the things that we discovered is that we were interested in disability, but we also lived very intensely in families together. We are both mothers of 3 children. And although Sarah identifies as non-disabled, at least temporarily so, and I identify as a person with a disability, we both use the world to make a family together. And one of the things that we say about disability studies and disability culture, and the area that I'm working in most fully now, and that is disability ethics or bioethics, is that disability is fundamental to the human condition. It occurs in every life and it occurs in every family. So I think that one of the real productive aspects of our relationship is that we were able to talk about how the built world and the blockages in the world that you were addressing in your project and that I was trying to think through as well affect how people in families, and everyone is in a family one way or another in life, how we operate, how we work in this way. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about how your family and you and the work of a family, the work of sustaining a family and making a place of flourishing for family members,
Yeah.
how that has shaped this book.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, it's so appropriate that you bring up the family unit because, of course, if people don't know, I mean, disability studies has such a large Venn diagram with feminist theory, right? Longtime feminist theory, which has always provoked us to question the idea of the autonomous atomic self, right? And to poke at independence as a mythology and also as a goal, and to make a concern for the public sphere in the, not just interdependence, but what feminists would call the derivative dependence, actually, of becoming a parent, which is to say, if you have children whose lives depend on you, you also, in terms of your relationship to the state, your relationship to employment, your relationship to the governance of public schools, become dependent. There is a vulnerability that you enter in your state of having, conjoined yourself with a family. And so the invitation is always on offer in a feminist perspective when one is in a caregiving relationship, certainly to children, and also, of course, to one's elders and other family members. The invitation is to see that Venn diagram between those feminist concerns and disability, deep disability wisdom that's on offer to everyone. And I will say, I mean, Rosemary, it meant the world to me. When I was in graduate school, my kids were very little. And I probably, on the day we had coffee, had like Cheerios in my hair. Like it was that kind of, very harried life. And I just remember both discovering, that we had both gone back to graduate school later, after our kids were born, and that we both, you just signaled to me in a powerful mentor way, keep going, keep doing what you're doing. And I was at that time piecing together in an intuitive way where disability studies dotted around the campus of Harvard and anthropology in places where that meets kind of disability. So I hope, I can only wish for the folks here who are young scholars or mid-career people to have meetings with someone senior in the field who just gives you that high five, like keep going, young person, but especially to say that as a mother. But then what else, what was the second part of what you sort of lobbed my way? Say that again.
I don't. um, well, I think, I
Oh,
mean,
just
you.
being Graham's mother. I should
Yeah,
probably talk about that.
I think that's important to talk about.
Yes, it is. Sorry. So I should say that I come to this work in large part because of my 14-year-old son, who's the eldest of my three children, who has Down syndrome. So my background is in visual arts and in cultural history, but it was really his arrival that captured my imagination, in the sense that we showed up at the OT and the PT and the speech therapist and a bunch of doctors, and I saw the material culture of his life, that is the prosthetics and the incredibly clever gear that were being built. And I also understood, because of my encounters with non-disabled people in the public, about what the kind of identity they were mapping onto him and onto us as a family, and the way that his genetic status sort of took over the way people spoke about him and at him and so on. And so I understood that the prosthetics and that material culture were doing a kind of mediating work, not just functional biological work, but also saying something about who he was expected to be in the world. And so my relationship to him and this ecosystem of mutual care that we live in together is one of the most nourishing ones in my life, and also a matter of deep, urgent politics. I actually do need a world far more elastic than it is for a person like him to thrive in it.
And I think that what you're talking about leads us into two other things that I wanted to talk about, and that is that I'm doing this work in bioethics, and what I'm interested in bioethics is trying to make the arguments that people with disabilities should continue to exist in the world, because much of what science and medicine is doing now, focusing on, and always has been, is not just treating the bodily variations that we think of as disabilities, or helping to make life better for people with disabilities, but to eliminate disability. And often to eliminate disability is to eliminate people who have disabilities. And there's no better example of this than people with cognitive disabilities, or people with congenital disabilities like my own. I have unusual hands. And so my disease category, my disability is not treatable. It cannot be eliminated, but my life is made better. My quality of life is higher, not because medical treatment has helped me. And this is not the case with everyone with disabilities, certainly, but because the redesigning of the world has made my life better, my quality of life much higher. And you have contributed to that initiative.
Mm.
And I want to talk about the distinctiveness of, I think, your contribution and the contribution of this book a little bit, by talking about two things. And I'm a literary person, so I've come up with two terms that I want us to talk a little bit about. And one of them is pace, and the other one is grace.
Mm.
And I'll begin with grace, actually, because I wanted to call up the way you talk about the objects that you and your colleagues have designed and built in the world. And I wanted to talk about, in particular, the object that I'm most familiar with that you and your colleagues and your students have designed, and that is something that you call the altar podium. And it's a lectern that I'm very familiar with because we were spending time together when you designed this. And it's a podium, or I like to call it the altar podium that you call it, or a lectern, that you and your colleagues designed for one of our friends and colleagues who is a well-known curator and a person of small stature, a little person.
Mm-hmm.
And I had been with Amanda a number of times in professional events where Amanda had to, get stools and books and boxes and so forth to stand up on in order to make the podium work well for her. And you designed a foldable, portable podium that is beautiful, that is bespoke for Amanda. And it was such a restoration of what I call her dignity, to see her be able to use this podium. And I love the way you describe the podium. It's getting dark in my office here. Um, and you say that it's something between a tool and a piece of architecture that roundly rejected the standard dimensions on which the built world is generally arrayed. And it proposed instead a way for Amanda's body and the room to meet each other differently. And I thought that this sentence was very characteristic of the way you talk and the way you write, which is very beautiful. And the objects that you work to design with your colleagues are equally beautiful. And what this entire package is, your language, your designs, your tools that get put forward in the world, help us with what I call grace, with what I call dignity management, because one of the most difficult things about being a person with a disability is that we have to relate to the world very often in ways that are interpreted as awkward. We make scenes, and
Mm.
the things that you designed have helped us restore a sense of aesthetic grace that is often taken away from us.
Mm.
And I particularly appreciate that and wonder if you want to say anything about that. Well,
I
I
mean,
turn the light on
yeah, sure.
in my office.
Yeah.
Hold on, keep talking.
Yeah, I mean, so Rosemary's referring to just a brief scene. The book is not really about my lab, but we do drop in there just in the opening chapter to visit Amanda coming to my classroom at Olin College where I teach. And yeah, I mean, it was Amanda's idea entirely, this misfit between her body and the built world that comes up in her profession. So she's a little person trying to reach a lectern standardized scale. And when I was at Harvard, I studied with Krzysztof Wodiczko. That's Wodiczko. And he coined this term interrogative design. And I don't get into this much in the book, a little bit at the very end, but this idea that design can do more than pose solutions. It can actually also pose questions some of the time. Sometimes what you want is a good workaday pragmatic solution, and the book is full of those. But sometimes you also want a question in the room, and that lectern with Amanda was a way of designing a thing that functioned well, but that had a very resonant question that was raised and actually lives as a question, which is to say that when Amanda enters a room and unfolds that lectern at her scale, the room sort of provisionally does come to her for a moment, and it alerts everyone in the room who's a standard height to take a look at the way the desks and the chairs are arranged and where the media outlets reside. And so that is a question in a material object form, right? So when you say misfitting is a materialist concept, I mean, I really wanted to, and I didn't know this really, I couldn't put it together really until the retrospect, Rosemary, but that is for me the materialist misfitting question that stays a question. It doesn't actually hide that. So Amanda uses that lectern even in her ordinary classroom now without even a lot of commentary, but it's a living question in a thing, packed into a thing, that solves a problem for her, but also helps everybody else in the room say, who is the world built for? Who,
And it
right?
looks like an altar, and that it gets called an altar podium gives it a grace. You call some of the things that you and your colleagues have designed and built charismatic things. And they are charismatic. They bring to us, as I said, a grace and a dignity that the world takes away from us. It's
Well,
often imagined that ramps are just kind of ordinary things, and very often they are. You showed a humble curb cut. A humble curb cut it has its own grace, but in particular, the things that I know that you've done, they have a grace of their own that exceeds the kind of grace of a curb cut. Another thing that you've been involved in designing that you don't mention in the book is a ramp that my colleague, the dancer Alice Shepard has used in her work, in her dance performance with her company, which is called Kinetic Light. She and her colleagues did a performance which was groundbreaking, ground shaking, called Descent. And you, with Alice, designed the ramp that was central to this dance performance. And it's these kinds of restorations of our dignity, which is so hard to hold on to, that I think have been a signature contribution of your designs. And so I really want to thank you for that and to call attention to it, and to say that the book describes, in the kind of language that you use, this restoration of our dignity through these beautiful objects. And I want also to talk about what I call pace, which you talk about most fully in your clock chapter. And I use the word pace, you use the word crypt time. But I want to expand a little bit the idea of just time or crypt time into the way we think about pace in general. And there's been a lot of really important work done around disability and pace and the history of time and the history of efficiency in modernity. Douglas Bainton has done a lot of this really important work, and many of us here, I hope, know Douglas Bainton's work. But you have some parts of your book that I want us to talk a little bit about, where you talk about pace in a way that is fairly new. Most of us with sensory or mobility disabilities experience the stigma of pace requirements all the time. Everything I do with my body, I do more slowly than is normally expected. But one of the things that you talk about in the book that I think is really important is pace in relation to cognition. Mm-hmm. Pace in relation to thinking. You talk about the important I'm sorry, my somehow I call up Siri on my many machines here. She just alerted up. And when I'm in the kitchen, I have to be particularly careful with ALXA. Mm-hmm. ALEXA, because sometimes she can be called up, but for some reason my iPad is making SIRI noises here, so I'm sorry about that. But you talk about pace in relation to thinking and in relation to eugenics, and the idea of the stigma against what we think of as being slow or being retarded. And of course, you're very alert to this because of the stigma that is directed against your boy Graham, because he has different cognitive capacity and cognitive pace from what is normally expected. And I want to read a sentence that you say here because I think it's very important, and I want you to talk a little bit about this. You say, it has been Graham is your boy's name, it has been Graham's singular creativity, his adaptive workarounds, his enigmatic learning curves that have wrested my husband and me from the grip of rigid time. And I found that to be, at least for me, one of the most important sentences in your book. And I'd like you to talk a little bit more about the ethical elements of that. My colleagues and I often talk about disability resourcefulness And we tend to think about that in the kind of workarounds that we typically do, those of us with sensory and physical disabilities. We don't often get to talk about the cognitive
Yeah.
workarounds that
Yeah.
you mentioned here. So
Yeah.
talk a little bit about that and about how that relates to eugenics and perhaps even the new eugenics, as you and I have
Yeah.
discussed.
So there's a lot there. Let me just say, first of all, that, this workarounds and resourcefulness, I hope that that is the driving animating force of the book. And I cite, of course, so many disabled scholars who have articulated this in lots of different ways. And where I've never seen it more creative and more urgent, creativity and urgency, powerfully wed together. I've never seen it more compelling than in the work of design. So in the material stuff itself. But I think sometimes people can see the urgency in the human rights issues almost a little easier than they can see the creativity, Rosemary. I don't know if you think that's true or not, but in my view, people have an under imagination of just how ingenious and how deeply plastic and adaptive everybody is. And if they were to see it that way, they would be interested. I mean, our research field is the most interesting in the world because it has that kind of deep imagination wed to deep politics. I mean, that is the definition of a powerful research domain. So I guess I just want to sort of bookmark that. I hope that that is the through line of the book, creativity and urgency.
The other element of that, of course, is interdependence, which
Yeah,
is
that's right.
crucial. And you can talk a little bit more about that too.
Yeah, but so Rosemary is referring to the last chapter of the book called Clock, and that is the place where design sort of stops doing its work, really, because when it comes to developmental disability and the design of time in our lives. So I do examine there. It opens with a scene kind of talking about the expanded crosswalk program in Singapore City, whereby if you're an older adult or a person with a disability on your Metro card, you can carry a little sensor that when you hover it over the call box for pedestrian crossing, it will give you an extra 12 or 13 seconds in the crosswalk just for you, and then it will revert to its normative time. And that to me is an ingenious concrete example of design for time, for making cities more flexible for slowness. But then I use that to open up to this much bigger conundrum, which is what is it like to be a person with non-normative intelligence and to not proceed through the rigors of a K-12 education and college to become what? An economic unit of a productive citizen, and to try to unpack the way that rigid time organizes normalcy in the developmental disability sense by the succeeding or failing to keep that pace, to become recognizable as an economic unit who's good at verbal ability and mathematical ability that are measurable, that are valuable to the culture. Why? As tax-paying citizens who fundamentally are workers. So I go through then the history of time a little bit, looking at some classic texts by Lewis Mumford, looking at Jim Trent's talking about the history of institutionalization. But really it's to point to anybody, any reader, and say, what is the kind of legacy of industrial time that organizes all of our lives, that gives each of us a kind of mandate for arriving at a certain kind of productive standard that gives us our human worth? And if we would, in this conversation here, if any of us here would reject that and say, well, I'm not just an economic unit, I want the ground of human worth to be something else. Well, what would it be? What would that thing be? What is the ground of a human being? So I try to estrange us productively from the clock and the way that it rules our lives. And it is certainly my son Graham's utter defiance of that normative clock that has shown me resources for rethinking the way that that is a mandate, again, a kind of invisible tacit mandate mapped onto our lives in a post-industrial culture. So we end that chapter in a really hopeful way with what's called, again, service design in my field, which is a community service program, kind of like City Year, but for young adults with both physical disabilities and or developmental disabilities. But instead of being on the receiving end of the community service, which they always are, they are on the giving end, and they spend 100 hours in a year cleaning up parks, doing urban agriculture, painting the doors of public high schools in the city of Boston. They're on the giving end of that. And then they do mock interviews and get some basic disability rights and so on. And I've never seen anything like it. These young people remaking the built world themselves and getting a line on a resume and so on. So that's a kind of like, is that the future, right? It won't be in products. It won't be in apps. It probably won't be in buildings. It's going to be like, can we arrange an encounter and a way to be together that can flex its structures and make human worth more visible? We could talk about this all night, Rosemary, but I do see the time and I want to involve folks from the audience too. So maybe if people want to drill down on that, we can. But Laura, were you going to say, let's maybe ask Pam to read some questions or
yeah. And before we launch into the questions, which you can put now in the chat, and Pam will be reading out your questions to our speakers, I'd like to give a special shout out, an honorary shout out to a special guest who's here tonight, and that's Ray Lifshay, Professor Emeritus of Architecture of City and Regional Planning from UC Berkeley, who is a senior in the field, an innovator, and who is at the forefront of design for disability. I'm so glad and so honored to have Ray with us today. For those of you who know him, who've read his work, who've worked with him or studied with him at UC Berkeley, he's also the author of that incredibly seminal book, Design for Independent Living. So we just want to give a little shout out to Ray and thank you for being with us. And where is Ray? Can we give a little highlight to Ray? Where are you, Ray?
I see Ray on my screen. And,
okay. Ray, you want to unmute and just say hello to some of your students and fans who are here? Ray, do you want to unmute for a second? No. Okay. Well, we're glad you're here. Thank you. Okay, we will now go on to some questions.
Okay, the first question is from Francis Kohler. Who benefits when we fail to bring a world where every human being has the maximum number of opportunities to thrive and contribute to our world? For example, I have often heard the cry, it will cost too much money to build a wheelchair ramp for that building. It's sickening how much money is funneled into the military to destroy lives, too often under the disingenuous cover of protecting our freedom, and pennies, if that, to nurture lives. That's not a rhetorical question.
No, Francis, it's not a rhetorical question. And the last question of my book is, what tools for assistance will we agree to owe each other, right? So, I mean, what kind of more than pennies will we decide to organize for a world where dependence is part of it? This is why I think folks like Ed Roberts and later scholar Eva Feder-Kinte, in redefining independence, like surely those are the most foundational knocks at what organizes our world, which is this kind of scorched earth use value of human beings, right? Pure numbers, pure efficiency and optimization. I mean, we know this, and yet a lot of us act as though it's regrettable, but it can't be helped. And I guess to me, the most biting critique of disability is this knock at independence and individualism. And this idea that you could organize a world with help in it, and that would be not just what we owe to people, but a desirable world with help in it, that actually designed for ecosystems of care and connection are what make us thrive and flourish. I mean, we do know this, but I mean, I also met a man named Steve Sailing, who's in the Room chapter. He's the last story in that chapter, who got a diagnosis of ALS 14 years ago and set about designing a residence for himself and other wheelchair users who have ALS or MS. And it's kind of smart home technology before those products came to the big box store, and it's a closed system, so it's private. But he, with a cursor that's mounted on the bridge of his glasses, the nose bridge of his glasses, that talks to a wheelchair mounted tablet, he can summon all the elevators and the doors and work the media and the HVAC and so on. So he has a quite automated technological life. But the thing that's interesting is that he has orchestrated with some technology, but mostly in an ecosystem of care, a life worth living. And he would say, until there's a cure, that technology is that cure. But he would say that that a life worth living might be built, this idea that there isn't just, in other words, a kind of measuring stick by which our productivity and our independence is the way we're going to measure ourselves, but that we look to people with disabilities and say, the world has already been remade with conditions of help and care in it, and it's worth living, it's worth organizing a world around. So, I mean, I can't say anything more than that, I agree with you.
Well, I could contribute to this also by saying that, and I've suggested this in the work I've been trying to do in bioethics, particularly focusing on questions of gene editing. One of the questions that I'm asked most often is, or any bioethicist is asked in relation to gene editing, and that is what human variations, what conditions, what disease categories are appropriate to edit out of the human community.
Yeah.
And it's a trap designed to name conditions that we think human beings that are not livable, that will produce lives that are not livable. And over again, what I have to say is what we really need is not a list of conditions that need to be eliminated from the human community, but a redistribution of resources to make and to produce and to support the technologies and the webs of interdependence that are necessary to make a high quality of life for all people, regardless of their genetic endowment.
Right. And I think, Rosemary, you and I have talked a lot over the years about the way that this actually comes home in very ordinary interactions in the medical complex. Like, it's very easy, I think, in this forum to be like, oh, yes, well, nobody wants to be graded as an economic unit and nobody wants to knock, interdependence. Really, that's the desirable world and so on. But meanwhile, there is a kind of everyday eugenics. We're seeing it in some of the rhetoric around COVID and the allocation of resources. And there's the uncomfortable truth, I'd say, in the clock chapter, what it means to be a pro-choice mother of a child with Down syndrome who's, the subject of selective termination really every day in a very mundane, kind of everyday, very common in cultures where there's a strong social safety net. And, I live with that challenge. I mean, and I live with it as a challenge, and I find it useful, embracing in a democracy, to talk about it. But nonetheless, in a very everyday way, the ordinary lives worth living question is alive and humming, right? That the deep association between normative intelligence and health, and conversely between non-normative intelligence and disease, is it's just commonplace, right? It's very little examined, to be honest, and it's difficult to talk about, again, because as someone who values reproductive autonomy and also who thinks about lives worth living in the non-normative sense. I know you share this. It's a really hard nut to crack.
It's a very good thing. I mean, people with disabilities are understood as expensive. We are understood as using up more resources than we deserve. And that narrative is one that is embedded in policy and in healthcare practices and in lots of other institutions, but particularly in policy and healthcare practices in ways that are truly discriminatory.
So we have a question from Adrian Lauby. Do you see your work over the next 4 years on these issues changing depending on the outcome of the presidential election?
That's a good question, Adrian. I mean, I'm as concerned about the election as any American citizen, but I would say I've spent too much time as a student of historians to see these issues as the next 4 years. Like, it seems to me, not just in the writing of the book, but also in the reading and talking to people and research, that these issues about what makes a human life valuable, what forms of assistance will we owe each other, how do you organize a kind of human flourishing that includes lots of people, these are enduring questions that are quite old, and they're also not going away anytime soon. I mean, the one thing that I would never say to you, oh, design can fix all this stuff. But I will say, as a person who's this sort of scholar and participant in culture making, that seeing that design can arrive from everywhere and can shape some behavior. I mean, that was the thing that, you know, it's not, you need policy, you need governance, you need economic structures. But I saw people in their living rooms and in their community centers and in their residences that they designed for themselves, but also at infrastructural scale with curb cuts, top down and bottom up. That design was one key factor in remaking the world in a direction that we want. So I do find myself, as a person who believes in culture and rhetoric and the power to change people's minds and the power of ordinary citizens to actually make change, I'm quite persuaded by that. I mean, it does matter symbolically and legislatively who we have at the federal level. And there are all kinds of things that people are doing all the time, creative and urgent things that people are doing all the time, that both span a longer history than a presidential term, right? And are also more ready at hand than we might imagine.
I have a question from Svetlana Borodina. Thank you for your talk. I'm curious about technology that breaks down, as well as about technology that is designed to appear helpful, but that is not in fact helpful at all. Examples would be ramps that are too steep or signs in Braille, but they appear as if they do, especially to able people with little knowledge about accessibility. Have you come across such artifacts and environmental elements? What work does bad but visibly accessible design do?
I mean, it's a kind of accessibility washing, I suppose. I mean, that's the cynical version, right? Where people are meeting a certain kind of, I mean, Amy Hamrai, who's a colleague of ours and a former student of Rosemarie's, calls this compliance knowledge. You know, it's merely addressing the kind of the letter of the law, you know, to avoid a lawsuit. And I think it's devoid of that creativity that comes with the urgency, which is to say, what makes a habitable space, right? And you know, the Institute for Human-Centered Design here in Boston, where I live, has a user expert lab where people will offer their expertise to, you know, nonprofit firms and also to industry to say whether this thing that I'm trying out, digital or hardware, is actually usable, right? It's not actually hard to figure out, like if something is a meaningfully accessible hotel room or whatever. So it is, you know, the entire architecture field, it seems to me, is plagued by this compliance knowledge view and has zero deep creativity associated with what it might mean to look at non-normative bodily experience as a constraint for inventive new structures. But Rosemarie, do you want to respond to that? I'm sure you encounter these things all the time.
No, let's go on to other questions. Thank you.
Okay.
Do we have any other questions to go? I do.
Yes,
Yes, we do. All right.
yes, yes. It's from Megan Hover. How do you think the pandemic is affecting people with disabilities and their participation in the world? For instance, I can see pros and cons to virtual events, like where closed captioning is available, people can participate from home, etc. Are there positive benefits to our current world surroundings?
Yeah, I mean, I'm watching this closely for sure. And so far as when I talk to my disability community, folks are saying, it's a little bittersweet. That is to say, there are folks who've been asking for things like robust telehealth services way before now, and suddenly they are now quite readily available. And we had the technology before now, and folks have wanted those things. And so it's making that possible. It's making telehealth possible, and hopefully in a way that will stay, right? Those doctors have gotten over the coefficient of friction to just get basically familiar, and now they'll be able to do it afterward. So there are things like that, making sort of distance services possible that for folks who live with immunocompromised conditions, for example, you know, we're facing quite a lot of barriers. I am, you know, and agree, right, that this virtual event and an awareness of closed captioning is among that as well. And I'm watching closely the advent of shared streets and thinking about both the possibilities and the you know, maybe pitfalls of slowing down streets and expanding restaurants to, you know, the sidewalk. And there are wheelchair access issues, but a city that's slower all around, I think, is a friendlier city to a lot of bodies. potentially. So those are being rolled out in prototypes, and I do think there's something to learn there for a lot of us, our bodies meeting the world. Here again, Rosemary, I want to just make space for you to talk about this if there's something
Yeah.
you...
In the world that I live in, the pandemic has created a new set of barriers. In that the technologies that people with disabilities have relied on to be able to have access and inclusion in the world and to carry out our lives effectively have been affected by the pandemic. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One thing, of course, is this Zoom technology. So on the one hand, digital interaction is understood and in some ways is more accessible for some people with disabilities because of the locational aspects of it. But on the other hand, no computer technology is fully accessible to people with disabilities. There is nothing more normalizing than a keyboard, or in a way more normalizing than a computer is, because they are machines that are built for a certain kind of body. So all of us use our computer technology, whether in sideways ways. So blind people need to use screen readers. Deaf people need to have some kind of access that is not entirely visual to computers. People with mobility impairments like mine, who don't type, are in a constant battle with a computer because of the use of the keyboard that's so fundamental to it. So while on the one hand, maybe this does open up new venues of access to people with disabilities, it also brings with it new barriers. So that's really important to remember when we have some, sort of utopian vision of what digital technology is how it's going to liberate all of us, that it's complicated. The other thing that I've seen in the pandemic that has thrown up tremendous barriers is the status of public transportation. So many disabled people rely on public transportation for access and inclusion in the world, and public transportation has been significantly compromised during the pandemic because of the requirement for social distancing that has taken place. So what that does is that it makes people reliant for transportation on cars, and many people with disabilities don't use a car or don't have access to cars. And this has been a tremendous barrier that's been thrown up in the pandemic.
I want to just acknowledge, Ray, if you wanted to say something, and also just to thank you for your presence and to say that your work absolutely has made my book possible. Did you want to speak up? Ray, were you raising your hand? You're on mute, Ray.
Dr. Lipschitz, you need to unmute yourself.
How is it now?
Yes. Good. We hear you.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
sir.
Welcome.
It says mute.
No, you're on.
It means that's the command to mute.
Well, first, your book will be so important, especially to people who still have not become, who are frightened of disability. And so that I think the book will be a great gift. Your language is a bit sophisticated, your examples, but I think on a much more prosaic level, I've been teaching at Berkeley for 50 years, and a good chunk of those years have been around teaching young people about disability, and not about disability, but about what it means to have our access and so on.
Yeah.
And they've been very, they've all been, and a large part of the teaching has been done in assistance with people with disabilities who assist me side by side, assist the students side by side.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of space in the world for this book, and it'll be a great gift. Secondly, I've also been involved in making a film about young people with disabilities. And we're working on a second film now, but the first film, which is now out, is called Crip Camp.
Yeah.
And the wherewithal of a young person with a disability is just extraordinary, especially when the family is very, very encouraging. And I would recommend seeing Crip Camp.
Oh, yes.
And I think your book will make people more aware of the beauties that have been already inaugurated in the urban environment, such as curb cuts and the coloration of curb cuts and the texturing of curb cuts. That adds measurably. Well, I don't have that disability, but I'm sure that it adds measurably to the comfort, and especially those who are walking with a cane and so on. So I don't have, I mean, much of your language is beyond me. These titles and so on, but I'm not saying it's just that I don't operate in that realm of intellectual sophistication. The second book, which has been out for a long time, is called Rethinking Architecture, which is also University of California, which was written with people with disabilities. So this sounds preachy when you say don't, but people who have disabilities, if they're encouraged by their families, or encouraged by can do amazing things. The new film will be the life of a young man named Victor Pineda.
Oh, yeah.
And that it will be an extraordinary example of the wherewithal and of a young person. And we're just speaking about a possible, Victor has traveled the world for the State Department. He has a PhD in city and regional planning. He teaches with me at Berkeley. He's quadriplegic. And he's a small boy, basically. And when confronted by situations, there's a Frank Sinatra song called My Way. And Victor sang that for me. And it will be in the film. It's just that that's his battle cries, my way. He will do it if given the opportunity to express his way. So I want to thank you for inviting me, Laura. I'm all for it.
Great.
A publication that's going to enhance public awareness. And this sounds like it's going to reach a population which I would not ordinarily reach with Rethinking Architecture. Thank
Thank
you.
you, Ray. I want to thank you again as well for being our guest tonight. And right now we've got to wrap this up. So I want to thank designer, author Sarah Hendren for her inspiring book, her work and her eloquence. And also to Rosemarie Garland Thompson for her incredible participation and a contribution to the work and her writing as well. And also I want to give a thank you, a big thank you to Gail Hardiman, who is behind the scenes doing our live captioning. So brava, thank you. This is the first time we've done live captioning, and we hope it will put us, Mechanics Institute, in a new direction to have more accessibility to our audiences out there. So once again, thank you to everyone who's participated tonight. Thank you to our audience, and come see us again. And once again, Sarah's book is available at alexanderbook.com. And we look forward to seeing you at our next program. And good night.